On the 31st of January, 1943, deep within the ravaged substructure of the Univag department store in Stalingrad, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus found himself seated at a table, his gaze fixed upon a document he had never envisioned appending his name to. The promotion to Field Marshal had arrived mere hours prior, a decree from Hitler leaving no room for ambiguity. No German Field Marshal had ever before capitulated. It was an order cloaked as an honor, a gilded confinement offering but one dignified avenue of escape. Yet Paulus had reached his limit with such pretense of honor. Around him, the entirety of the Sixth Army had effectively disintegrated as a cohesive fighting entity. Of the nearly 290,000 men who had been ensnared 11 weeks earlier, scarcely 90,000 drew breath. Many could barely remain upright. In December, they had resorted to consuming their horses. By January, they were boiling leather footwear in a desperate bid for sustenance. Soviet officers then entered the subterranean chamber. Paulus rose, his countenance gaunt, his uniform hanging loosely upon a frame that had diminished by 20 pounds. He affixed his signature to the surrender instrument with a hand that quaked, not from apprehension, but from sheer exhaustion and malnutrition and the profound weight of the moment. His final transmission to Hitler, dispatched hours before the arrival of Soviet forces, was devoid of theatricality. Sixth Army, true to their oath and conscious of the lofty importance of their mission, have held their position to the last man and the last round for Führer and Fatherland unto the end, it stated. The words were precise, formal, and hollow. What could possibly be articulated to signify any consequence? The Sixth Army was decimated. The protracted siege of Stalingrad, which Hitler had vaunted would secure Germany's invincibility in the East, had instead consumed an entire army. However, within that subterranean space, as Paulus signed away his army's existence, a more profound entity was also relinquishing its hold. The conviction that any withdrawal was temporary, that setbacks were reversible, that Germany's eastward advance was merely on a brief hiatus. For those commanders who comprehended the true implications of Stalingrad, this was not merely a lost engagement. It was a glimpse into an inescapable future. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein understood this before many others. As the commander of Army Group A, he had attempted to relieve Stalingrad in December, coming within 30 miles before being halted by Soviet forces. He had implored Paulus to break out while opportunities, fuel, and strength still permitted. Hitler, however, had forbidden it. The Sixth Army was to hold Stalingrad, a mandate stemming directly from Hitler's declaration. Following Stalingrad's fall, Manstein began advocating for what he termed, in essence, a strategic adjustment. This was a carefully chosen diplomatic phrase. What he truly meant was a tactical disengagement, yielding territory to preserve combat strength, trading ground for time, and shortening the front lines to a manageable extent for Germany's available divisions. He elaborated on this in his memoirs years later, but the argument was forcefully presented in real time in early 1943, when the stark reality was immediate and undeniable. He wrote, "The mathematics were simple. The Soviet Union possessed a greater population, more industrial capacity, more geographical depth for retreat, and a higher capacity to absorb casualties. Germany had already committed its entire strength to the Eastern Front, and it proved insufficient." Manstein proposed what he labeled the backhand blow strategy. The Soviets were to be allowed to advance, extending their supply lines, whereupon a counteroffensive would strike their flanks, severing their spearheads and annihilating them piecemeal. This required ceding territory. It necessitated accepting that German forces would indeed retreat, at times for hundreds of miles, before launching a decisive strike. Hitler's response was swift and absolute. No, not one step back. Any ground voluntarily relinquished, he believed, would be irretrievably lost. The psychological repercussions for the German populace, the military, and Germany's allies would be catastrophic. Territory represented prestige. Retreat signified defeat. Therefore, no retreat was permissible. Manstein persisted with various arguments, presenting maps illustrating the insurmountable length of the front lines and casualty reports demonstrating how static defense was depleting the army. He explained that mobile defense was not synonymous with retreat. It was a matter of operational art, the means by which victory could be achieved when numerical parity with the enemy was unattainable. Hitler would listen, sometimes for extended periods, only to refuse. The Führer harbored his own strategic framework, forged in the trenches of the First World War and solidified by the successes of 1939 through 1941. Victory was achieved through holding ground and attacking. Defeat resulted from retreat. It was, in his view, a simple calculus. However, this was far from simple, and the commanders tasked with executing Hitler's directives were acutely aware of this. They had witnessed the fate of the army at Stalingrad when it attempted to maintain an untenable position. They were now observing a similar, albeit slower, unfolding across the entire Eastern Front. The spring of 1943 brought a temporary stabilization. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, arrested major military operations. Both sides engaged in rebuilding and strategic planning. Hitler, convinced that a singular decisive victory would shatter Soviet morale, ordered preparations for Operation Citadel. This was to be a massive offensive targeting the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines that presented an opportunity for encirclement. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, vocally opposed Citadel from its inception. This officer, who had pioneered blitzkrieg tactics and led the rapid advance to the English Channel in 1940 and the thrust toward Moscow in 1941, viewed the Citadel plan as a harbinger of disaster. The inherent flaw was evident to anyone who thoroughly examined the intelligence reports. The Soviets were fully aware of the impending attack and had months to fortify their defenses. The Kursk salient was not a vulnerability. It was a formidable stronghold. Soviet forces had constructed multiple defensive layers, deployed millions of mines, positioned thousands of anti-tank guns, and massed their armored reserves for retaliatory strikes. Guderian argued that Germany's reconstituted panzer divisions ought to be preserved for mobile defense in the West, anticipating the inevitable Allied invasion. Engaging entrenched Soviet defenses, he contended, would annihilate these divisions without achieving any strategic gain. Even if Citadel achieved tactical success, its impact would be negligible. It would not alter the fundamental imbalance of forces, nor would it force the Soviet Union out of the war. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the Ninth Army in the northern pincers of the Citadel offensive, shared Guderian's pessimism. His intelligence staff had identified 8 defensive belts in his sector, extending nearly 100 miles inland. Aerial reconnaissance indicated substantial Soviet reserve concentrations behind these lines. He duly reported these findings to Hitler, not to obstruct the offensive, but to ensure complete awareness of the challenges ahead. The offensive commenced on the 5th of July. Within days, Model's Ninth Army had advanced a mere 10 miles at a catastrophic cost, each mile paid for with destroyed tanks and fallen infantry. The southern pincer, under Manstein's command, advanced further but encountered similar relentless resistance. By the 12th of July, when Soviet forces launched a counteroffensive near Prokhorovka, In what would become the largest tank engagement in history, Citadel had already faltered. Hitler called it off on the 13th of July. The casualty reports corroborated Guderian's grim predictions. Approximately 200,000 German casualties and hundreds of tanks rendered inoperable or destroyed. The revitalized panzer divisions were effectively shattered. And for what? The Kursk salient remained intact, and Soviet forces were already mounting their counteroffensive. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, which Germany had held since June of 1941, was irrevocably lost. Guderian's post-war memoirs offered a somber observation regarding Citadel. The armored formations, painstakingly reformed and re-equipped, suffered heavy losses in both personnel and material, and would now be unusable for a considerable period. His understated language could not conceal his profound anger. Germany had squandered its final offensive reserves for no discernible gain. Hitler, however, drew a different conclusion. Citadel, in his estimation, had not failed due to strategic miscalculation. It had faltered because the army had not exerted sufficient effort, because commanders had been overly cautious, and because the will to victory had waned. His proposed solution was increased fanaticism, unwavering determination, and an absolute refusal to retreat. Throughout the latter half of 1943 and into 1944, this pattern recurred across all sectors. Soviet offensives would breach German lines. Local commanders would seek authorization to withdraw to more defensible positions. Hitler would deny these requests. The positions would be overrun, the forces encircled or annihilated, and the front line would collapse far beyond the extent of any planned withdrawal. Field Marshal Model observed this grim progression from the West. By 1944, he commanded Army Group B in northern France, preparing for the Allied invasion that was widely anticipated. Model had fought the British in North Africa and understood the consequences of facing an adversary with overwhelming material superiority. He had executed strategic retreats across Libya, engaged in delaying actions, and striven to conserve his forces for engagements he could realistically win. Now, he was tasked with repelling an Allied invasion on the beaches with insufficient troop strength, with the Luftwaffe largely absent from the skies, and with panzer reserves positioned too far inland due to Hitler's insistence on centralized command. Model meticulously analyzed the situation and recognized a terrifying parallel to Stalingrad, albeit unfolding at a slower pace. The invasion commenced on the 6th of June. Within days, Model understood the battle was lost. The Allies had established a secure beachhead, and German counterattacks failed to dislodge them. Allied air supremacy rendered daylight movement perilous. The panzer reserves, when they finally arrived, were committed to the conflict piecemeal and destroyed. On the 15th of July, 1944, Model dispatched a memorandum to Hitler. The language was carefully worded, professional, yet the message was unequivocally clear. The logical course of action entailed negotiating an end to the war. Model did not explicitly state this, nor could he, but every reader of the memorandum understood its import. The war was lost. The only remaining question was the extent of further devastation Germany would endure before acknowledging this reality. Hitler's response was to relieve Model of his command after the field marshal was wounded in an Allied air raid. The commander who had suggested drawing appropriate conclusions from military realities was replaced by subordinates who would fight until all means of resistance were exhausted. However, reality remained indifferent to Hitler's directives. 3 days after Model penned his memorandum, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration against Army Group Center in Belarus. This was Stalingrad magnified tenfold. Soviet forces, deploying over 2 million men, shattered the German front within the initial hours. Entire divisions ceased to exist. Command and control structures collapsed. Retreat devolved into a chaotic rout. By the conclusion of Bagration in late August, Army Group Center had been annihilated. 28 divisions were eliminated, resulting in approximately 400,000 German casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. These losses surpassed those incurred at Stalingrad. The Soviet advance reached the outskirts of Warsaw, liberated Belarus, and pushed into Poland. The surviving commanders of Bagration emerged with the vacant stares of men who had witnessed something beyond mere military defeat. They had seen the Wehrmacht broken as an effective fighting force. The Eastern Front, which had drained German strength for 3 years, had finally consumed everything. No reserves remained, no veteran divisions to shore up the crumbling lines. Only fragmented units, assemblies of survivors, boys, and elderly men rushed forward to perish in place of the soldiers who no longer existed. In the West, the front collapsed in parallel. Paris fell in August. Allied forces surged across France. By September, they had liberated Belgium and Luxembourg and were approaching Germany's western frontier. The Thousand-Year Reich was being invaded from 2 directions simultaneously, and the army ostensibly tasked with its defense was scattered across 1,000 miles of continuously retreating front lines. General Heinz Guderian, recalled from semi-retirement to assume the role of Chief of the General Staff, found himself in an untenable predicament. He was expected to orchestrate Germany's defense with divisions that existed solely on paper, with fuel that was not being produced, and with replacement soldiers who had never fired a rifle before being dispatched to the front. His confrontations with Hitler became legendary among the surviving staff officers who witnessed them. Guderian would present intelligence reports detailing Soviet troop concentrations, the critical gaps in German defenses, and the mathematical impossibility of maintaining current positions. Hitler would dismiss this intelligence as defeatist propaganda, redrawing front lines on maps as if mere colored pins could conjure divisions from nothing. In January of 1945, Guderian presented irrefutable evidence of a massive Soviet buildup for an offensive into Poland and East Prussia. The intelligence was overwhelming. Thousands of tanks, millions of men, artillery concentrations that would render Bagration a mere preliminary bombardment. Hitler's response entered the annals of history due to its sheer absurdity, meticulously documented by multiple witnesses. The greatest bluff since Genghis Khan. The Soviet offensive commenced on the 12th of January. Within days, German forces in Poland were in full retreat. Within weeks, Soviet armies reached the Oder River, a mere 40 miles from Berlin. Hitler's pronouncements notwithstanding, the front line had advanced mere 300 meters westward, and what remained of Germany's eastern armies had been destroyed. Guderian made another attempt in February, advocating for the evacuation of the Courland Pocket in Latvia, where 26 divisions were isolated and effectively contributing nothing. Those divisions, he argued, could reinforce the defense of Germany itself. Every general on the staff concurred. The logic was irrefutable. Hitler refused. The Courland divisions, he insisted, would tie down Soviet forces and would be evacuated by sea when circumstances permitted. They were to hold their ground. Guderian, according to his own account and those of witnesses, directly informed Hitler that the war was lost, that Germany faced complete annihilation, and that the only rational course was to seek terms while some negotiating leverage remained. Hitler's response was to dismiss Guderian from his position. The chief of the General Staff, who dared to speak the unvarnished truth, was replaced by someone more amenable. By March, Guderian was gone. and the defense of Germany was being coordinated by officers who had learned that survival meant conforming to Hitler's fantasies. However, these fantasies were unraveling faster than new ones could be conceived. In the West, Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March. In the East, Soviet armies encircled Berlin in April. The Reich, envisioned to endure for a millennium, was now measured in days. The commanders who remained could be categorized into three groups. Some, like Heinrich Himmler, pursued delusional schemes to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, oblivious to their unconditional surrender policy. Others, like Hermann Göring, attempted to position themselves as Hitler's successors, ready to accept surrender on marginally better terms. And some, such as Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl, simply continued to obey orders, lacking any alternative course of action. Hitler committed suicide on the 30th of April. Admiral Karl Dönitz, appointed as his successor, inherited a Germany that had ceased to exist as a functioning state. The critical question was no longer whether to surrender, but how to manage the surrender to minimize the number of German soldiers and civilians falling into Soviet captivity. On the 7th of May, 1945, General Alfred Jodl sat in a red schoolhouse in Reims, France, and signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The ceremony was brief, formal, and devoid of any dramatic flair. Jodl had been authorized to sign by Dönitz, who in turn had been empowered by Hitler's last will and testament, drafted in a bunker while Soviet artillery pounded the ruins above. Jodl's statement during the signing contained no defiance, no claims of honorable combat against overwhelming odds, and no insinuations of internal betrayal. It expressed only exhaustion. The hope for leniency was faint. The victors had witnessed the concentration camps. They had counted 20 million Soviet dead, 6 million Polish dead, and millions more across Europe. They had observed Germany fighting to the bitter end, systematically destroying cities, infrastructure, and lives in a conflict that had been lost for years. The figures at the surrender were a stark testament to the consequences of perpetual refusal to acknowledge reality. Approximately 7,600,000 German prisoners of war were in Allied hands. 5,300,000 German military personnel were deceased. Millions more were wounded, missing, or irrevocably broken. An army that had marched into Poland in September of 1939 with the unwavering confidence of inevitable victory had been pushed back all the way to Berlin and beyond, into captivity and graves. Yet this retreat was never acknowledged as permanent until the very final moment. Hitler had forbidden the very word. Commanders who proposed strategic withdrawals were dismissed or ignored. Armies that should have retreated to defensible lines were ordered to hold untenable positions and were annihilated in place. The mobile defense advocated by Manstein in early 1943, which might have prolonged the war or created opportunities for a negotiated settlement, was rejected in favor of fanatical last stands that yielded no strategic advantage, only increased casualties. The commanders who survived to surrender, who lived to pen their memoirs and testify at Nuremberg, uniformly recounted variations of the same narrative. They knew, some after Stalingrad, others after Kursk, and most after the summer of 1944. They understood the war was lost, that retreat was now permanent, and that Germany was destined for total defeat. However, knowing and acting upon that knowledge were vastly different propositions. The Wehrmacht was Hitler's instrument, and its commanders served at his discretion. Speaking truth to Hitler typically resulted in dismissal from command at best, and execution at worst. The few who attempted such action, including the officers involved in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, were brutally hanged. Consequently, those commanders who comprehended the truth but were unable to act upon it found themselves in an untenable position. They could clearly perceive the future. They could perform the mathematical calculations of declining force ratios, shrinking territories, and depleted resources. They could analyze intelligence reports regarding Soviet and Allied strength. They knew precisely what the end would entail. And then, they would return to their headquarters and issue orders for yet another defensive line, one more counterattack, one more desperate attempt to secure ground that was inherently indefensible, because those were the directives from above. The system they served possessed no mechanism for acknowledging objective reality. The tragedy was not simply that Germany lost. The profound tragedy lay in the protracted, ruinous, and destructive manner of Germany's defeat, grinding itself and much of Europe into rubble through a retreat that was visible to all but would not be admitted by anyone in authority. In the Univag basement in Stalingrad, Paulus had signed the initial acknowledgement. In the schoolhouse in Reims, Jodl signed the final one. Between these two signatures lay 2 years and 3 months of continuous retreat that was never designated as such, of defensive lines that existed solely on paper, and of armies that fought and perished in place because withdrawal was forbidden, even when it represented the only rational course of action. The commanders were aware. The evidence was overwhelming. The trajectory was unmistakable. Yet, the system they served prioritized fanaticism over rationality, propaganda over truth, and Hitler's intuition over military realities. Thus, they continued to fight, retreating all the way to unconditional surrender. And this retreat was only officially acknowledged as permanent when there was literally nowhere left to retreat.